In this screencast, I want to talk a little bit about language choices. And as we read critically, as we are critical readers, I want to think about how the author's language choices reveals their the author's theoretical perspective. I'd like to start with an analogy. Language learning is like learning to walk, or language learning is like learning to play an instrument, learning music. So let's compare these and let's think about which is more analogous to language learning. Okay, so when we learn to walk, that is a shorter development period than to play an instrument, which is obviously a longer development period, and we can continue to learn and grow even into teenage and adulthood. Also, learning to walk, the locomotion is the primary function of our legs and feet and our toes, but music is a secondary purpose. We have fingers and mouths or whatever we use for another purpose, and we use it for music. Also, when we learn to walk, the coordination is quite complex, but the result is relatively consistent, right? If we look at my walking and your walking and someone's walking from another part of the world, the result is going to look the same. But for playing an instrument, coordination again required is complex. The result of playing is probably begins in a simple way. We play something simple, but then it increases in complexity. We could have all kind of embedding and iteration and variation. There's not going to be that much variation. There's going to be a lot more variation in learning to play an instrument across time and also across cultures. So learning to walk is very much a physical development, where locomotion is the same across cultures, but playing an instrument is a cultural development. It's learned from others. Music differs from culture to culture, and we can learn instruments and music from other cultures, but we don't really learn how to walk in another culture, per se. Okay, so of course no analogy is perfect, but how does each analysis and the use of each analogy influence your understanding of language learning? If you think language learning, if you use the analogy language learning is like walking, what does that reveal about your theoretical perspective? If as opposed to, what if you think language learning is more like learning music? And also, which do you think language learning is more like? Some other terms I would like to review is the idea of acquisition versus learning. Some authors use these interchangeably, but I would like to point out that acquisition, there is an emphasis on automatic or at least less effort, whereas learning has more of a more effortful connotation. Acquisition also carries the connotation that it's a completed process, whereas learning has more of an emphasis on the process and it's ongoing. And the word acquisition has been more closely tied to L1, whereas the term learning is applicable more broadly, not just with language learning, but general learning. So think about how the choice of words reflect a theoretical perspective. Now, in the field, we do use a lot of initialisms, and one of our favorites is SLA. It's a nice abbreviation. It's very well known. It's very common, and it does stand for Second Language Acquisition. I prefer to refer to second language development second language learning as development. There is a lot of pushback. One of my publications, I used that term, and a reviewer said, just use acquisition. It's common. And I refused. I wanted to hold on to my theoretical framework of second language development. And also other people in the field in published papers have referred to it as second language development. Another idea that I feel quite strongly about is that their language is patterns, not rules. Humans are pattern finders, not just with language, but with lots of things. That's a big part of how humans learn. And actually it's not confined to humans. Animals learn by patterns, and language has patterns, but not rules. And people use language, and the users decide which patterns to follow. See the difference there? With using the term rule, I think it incorrectly implies that the rules come first, and then the people have to follow them, like traffic rules. And, bad things will happen if you break the rules. But actually, we as language users choose which pattern to follow, and they mean different things. For instance, in English, a lot of times agents go in subject position. That's a very common pattern, but we can choose to use a passive, and that reflects something else. That does some other different linguistic work. Also, the phrase exceptions to the rule proves that it's a rule. No, actually, that's not true. It does not prove it's a rule. It proves that it is in fact not a rule. It's a pattern, which is usually followed, but we have choices. So just think about, as you're completing your readings, how the language choice reflects the author's theoretical perspective. Do you think Kristen Hummel, can you identify her theoretical perspective? And what about Lourdes Ortega or Brown, our other main reading? So think about them.